Sally, would you describe for us what are some of the examples of how you've brought organizational change to your organization that supports a new mission and a new direction for what you're attempting to do?
Well, I think one of the primary examples is programming as opposed and in conjunction with supervision only. We're going through a rough budget time in Iowa, much like the rest of the nation. And traditionally, what you would hear during a time like that is, let's get back to basics, we need more probation officers, etc. And while we acknowledge that you need to supervise offenders and hold them accountable, as important is providing programming that matches their motivation level and addresses their criminogenic needs. And so what we found especially curious during this tight budget period is, in the past, there had been requests by staff to eliminate, well, you got to get rid of treatment and get rid of this and get rid of that. And really, that discussion hasn't occurred to the level that it did even 10 years ago. And I think one other piece is that it's common practice. Staff don't even think about the fact that you're going to use assessment, and with that assessment, you're going to triage your resources. You're going to put low-risk people on banked caseloads. We have caseloads of 800 people with recidivism rates of about 5 to 6%, with very few of those rearrests being felony level, most of them being additional simple misdemeanor or that level. So being able to use our resources in a way that fits with the research. And then I know you only asked for two, but one that I'd just like to point out is catching people doing right applies to both staff and offenders. And a lot of these principles that we use with offenders, we now use with our employees. We do interviewing and hiring practices that are behavioral in nature. So you don't just do a standard question answer. You actually do a role play with people that you're hiring to make sure you're hiring the right kind of people. And I think one of the other pieces is being able to measure what you're doing and feeding that back to staff.
Sally, thank you. I appreciate particularly your bringing in the discussion of how you use evidence-based work around human resource management. I think we've gotten to the point now where we expect that this business is about using assessment tools to sort populations. But when we start talking about alignment, it does mean all of our business practices, including how you recruit, who you select, that whole process that you described, and I think that's very important for us. David, would you describe as you run a massive statewide organization, what are some of the things that you've undertaken about organizational change in Arkansas? And we're hoping we still have David on the line.
Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry. George, there's three areas that I would like to discuss here today that have had a significant impact. Of course, we've had to look at doing business completely different than what we did 10, 15 years ago. The issue, one of the first things we do is try to get our staff to look at doing business differently than just trailing, jailing, and nailing them, is that we've got to be able to work with offenders in the community. And three things that we have done in addition to a lot of training is we've set up, when this agency was set up, it was set up as a community punishment agency. And we had community punishment centers, and those centers were designed to put offenders in for a short period of time. They would be in colorful uniforms. They would be worked out in the public, embarrassed, and sent home and would not return. We found that to not be the case, is that we had a high rate of return. Over the last 10 years, we have turned those into therapeutic communities, and what we've seen is a significant drop in the number of offenders who come in. We're dealing with behavior. Changing that behavior. The other issue is that we have had a significant impact with the state and saved a considerable amount of money during these tight budget crunches is technical violator centers. Is that we set up a 300-bed facility in the state where all of our technical violators are sent to there regardless of their initial sentence. And what we have seen is a significant reduction in the number of violators ending back up in the Department of Correction. The third issue that we have had significant impact with on evidence-based practices is drug courts. We started with one in 2001. Today we have 42 up and running. So with these, of course, in addition with training, motivational interviewing, a lot of things, of course, as you put these in practice, you've got to do a lot of work with your field staff in order to get them to look at doing business differently than what they did in the past.
Thanks, David. Kate, I think we're back up to another polling question, aren't we?
We are, George. We'd like to ask the audience at this time about budget processes and how evidence-based principles affect those processes. And while we're waiting for the responses, okay, great. We've had everyone respond, and it looks like 70% feel like evidence-based practices do, in fact, affect the budget trimming process. 13% are responding that budget trimming does stem from evidence-based principles, and 15% feel that it does not have an impact on the budget process.
Well, let's find out from a person who has to deal with budget allocation. Jerry, in Texas, obviously you have a huge business process there, and during tough economic times have to make some very tough decisions. For you as a state legislator, how does the whole change to an evidence-based approach impact you in your decision making?
Well, George, I will tell you that in all honesty, it's had a great deal of impact on me. Texas did some bold things in the last 3 legislative sessions that started in 2005. And I was the fortunate one that got the opportunity to implement many of these changes. When I became chairman of the Corrections Committee in 2005, I got one instruction. Basically, it said, don't build new prisons. They cost too much. And prior to 2005, I had no experience and little knowledge of corrections and probation systems. But I'm an engineer by background and have a district that didn't even have a single prison. I may have been lucky to have been so ignorant that I didn't know the restrictions of what I could and couldn't do. So as an engineer, I became interested in facts that made a difference from the many of my legislative colleagues. It made me very different from many of them. It was basically a show-me-the-numbers approach. So that's where you start looking at evidence and evidence-based. The evidence and the evidence-based practices were really important to me in looking at, well, what are the choices that we would have that specifically were building new prisons. In 2005, we started looking at probation, discovered that's where most of the people came from that are in prison today. We worked on a bill to improve probation in Texas to expand drug and specialized courts and give more support to our probation departments. And is something new, and I didn't know that I could carry this big a piece, and got it all the way to within one vote. It got vetoed by the governor, but we came back and it gave us the knowledge and the ability to be prepared for the next session. And when we started in 2007 legislative session, things had changed significantly. Our budget board had estimated to us that Texas would need 17,000 new prison beds by the year 2012. And the governor in his budget request had included a request for 3 new prisons in Texas with a construction cost of well over $500 million. This did not include any operating costs, which we have been about $100 million a year, or since we do a biennium budget, at least $200 million every time we came back in looking for just those prisons. And we should have expected that in the session we just did in 2009, we would have expected an additional prison building somewhere probably in the neighborhood of $350 million that we would have had to done in the 2010 and 2011 budget. Fortunately, Texas had some history and data from prison experience and probation and parole programs that did show things that did work. We did have some evidence-based practices, and we started asking questions. What were these programs? How much did they cost? How many beds and what type did we need? And what would happen to the prison population if we did these things? And we started to get answers. The cost would be significantly less than the $500 million to build the prisons. We could obtain at a reasonable schedule the beds we would need. And if implemented, the prison population growth would be decelerated. In other words, we could do the programs that made our streets, homes, and communities safer and also saved us a substantial amount of money.
Jerry, that sounds way too logical and way too rational. Those of us who have had careers as public administrators don't expect that to take place. How novel do you think that is as you visit, not only with your colleagues within Texas, but as you travel around the country on the work of the CSG board? Is this a new approach that legislators are serious about?
We have had several states that have taken up that approach, George, that are looking into that. Kansas is a lead example that they've done. They did several things in that area. We're working with North Carolina. We've had interest from Florida and Georgia and Arizona and several other states that we're working with now to look specifically at the kinds of things that we did. Because what really happened, George, was, first of all, our crime rate is down since 2007, as is our violent crime rates, and the numbers in almost every community match that. We are safer than we were. We started more people in substance abuse treatment centers. We built and opened intermediate sanction facilities for probation and parole. We have more halfway houses for places for former inmates to live when they transfer back into the general population, and increased mental health funding by $5 million a year to those in the prisons and those in our probation departments. We've also increased and funded significant increases in specialized courts for drug, alcohol, juveniles, and veterans. And we expanded in-prison treatment for drug and alcohol addiction. All those sound good, but the question was to show us the data. At the time we finished putting the substance abuse and intermediate sanction facilities online, we had almost 157,000 people incarcerated in our state prisons. When the legislature returned in 2009, due to these changes, we had implemented the Legislative Budget Board, who had 2 years earlier said we needed 17,000 new prison beds, projected that Texas would not need another new prison until sometime at least 2015 or later. As of the first of last month, we had 153,500 people incarcerated, which is down 3,500 roughly from where we were at 2 years earlier. We also had 1,800 people previously in county jails in 2007 from our Department of Correction. Today we have none. They're all brought back into the prison system. And when the legislature returned in 2009, we actually determined that we kept those programs and kept those fundings in place, and are now considering closing prisons for the first time in Texas, and that looks like something we would probably do in the year 2012 or 2013. In addition to that, our parole revocations are down by about 25%, all of which shows that we can get success, and that other states are actually, many of them are lining up to do that. I'm chairman of one of the major committees at National Conference of State Legislators, and also a major subcommittee at the American Legislative Exchange Conference, and both of those groups are very interested in the things we're doing, and we're seeing a lot of interest from other legislators around the country.
You know, this is really important for us who are in this business to see Texas be successful like this, because it frequently works to our advantage that a very large state, and a state that has had a history of being known as being rather conservative and tough on crime, the ability to see that you have taken on these new business practices with success that's actually measurable, is very important to us.
George, I got a good chuckle when you described Arkansas as a massive system. I love my friends in Arkansas, but it's comparatively not as massive as what we have.
It all becomes relative, doesn't it?
It is all relative at that stage. That's correct.
Sally, you work at this from a different direction. You're dealing in a criminal justice system where there is a state oversight, state financing, but there's also local governance through a board of directors made up of primarily elected officials. So how does this work for you?
Well, I think many of the things that have already been said hold true here. When looking at resources, each of the major departments, Department of Education, Department of Public Safety, Department of Health, etc., are asked, for information. And one of the things that I think has been very helpful, just again piggybacking on what's already been said, is that we have a comprehensive data system that's been able to show them what it is we're doing and what our outcomes are. And I think the other piece that's been very helpful is when we started doing a lot of this evidence-based practices stuff nearly 20 years ago in the early 90s, all of it was, well, it works in Canada, and we want to try it, and we think it's a good thing to do. And now, with tight budgets, we've been able to show, we have a very high success rate with our drug court. Overall, our probation revocations are only 10%. Our parole violations are only 26%. Compare that to national numbers, and we have very, very good outcomes. And if you cut these programs, this is what we think might happen. I'm just repeating what's already been said. The one question about evidence-based practice, or the one concern that we've tried to also be careful about, is in Iowa we're doing some of the green light, red light kind of stuff. This program looks like it works. This program looks like it doesn't work. Green light if it's good, red light if it's bad. What the concern that we have about this is that people forget about one of the main things in evidence-based practices is that you have to have tight quality control, tight quality assurance. Because if you're just doing a program in theory and there's nobody checking up to make sure that your assessments are scored correctly, that the material is being done in a way that it's supposed to be, that there's the right kind of follow-through, all of a sudden you're going to throw out a program saying the program's bad, when the real problem was implementation and also follow-through with quality assurance. And we've seen that with a few of our programs where they said, you know what, substance abuse treatment in prison doesn't work. Well, in Iowa anyway, well, there's a problem with that, because what you look at is substance abuse treatment in prisons work if there's follow-up in the community. You're right. If you're not going to fund the aftercare or the resources that are needed to follow that offender once they discharge from prison, you may as well not provide the treatment in prison to begin with. And what's been helpful is to have that information and to be able to articulate that it's not based on my gut we need to have aftercare. It's based on some hard numbers that are Iowa numbers. They're not Canada numbers. They're not Texas numbers. They're Iowa numbers.
I think that's really important. I think you've hit several things there. One, as Don Evans, another Canadian, emphasizes with me over and over again, it's not that the bodies of knowledge have already been established, but we do have an obligation to continue through the integrity and the fidelity of what we do to continue to advance new bodies of knowledge about what is effective. And as you say, the only way that we're really going to be able to do that is to bring integrity to how we implement what we implement, that there's a fidelity between the design and the actual implementation. And that takes hard work. That's a real struggle. But if we don't do that, you're correct. We don't know what really was the impetus for success or for failure. Kate, have you got another polling question that we can use?
Yes, we do, George. And at this time, we'd like to ask folks how substantially they work with legislators, both on a county and state level, about evidence-based practices and policies. And while we wait to collect these responses, we'd like to let everyone know that the PowerPoint presentation and the audio program will be posted on CJI's website later this week. We would also like to remind folks that they can submit questions for the panelists to respond to later in the event, and we will be collecting them throughout the event. And it looks like we have collected the majority of the responses. 25% of the audience says that they do substantially work with their legislators. 47% said no, not at this time, and another quarter said they do not at this time, but they would like to.
Well, let's pick up then with, and again, I apologize for not having the presentation up in front of me, and so we may have a panel on the screen right now that doesn't fit. But the question I would really like to pose to all three of our panelists is how we might improve the communication, the effective communication with the legislators who are going to make decisions, and not just money decisions, but also programmatic decisions, both at the county government level and at a state government level. David, you've had a long history even going back into those days when we were trying to convince state legislators that they really ought to vote for this thing called the Interstate Compact. And I watched you work effectively with state legislators in Arkansas. From your experience, how do you communicate in a way that is really relevant to your local legislators?
George, let me say this. It's very critical, and I think this issue's already been brought up about having good data. I know when I started here as a director, we had about a $40 million budget. Today, we have over an $80 million budget. We had around 700 staff. Today, we have 1,396 staff. The issue, in addition to the Interstate Compact, we looked at, we were able to gather our numbers. We saw what was driving the prison population. We went to the legislators and said, here's some numbers initially. We said, here's some numbers, here's what we feel very certain that we can do, but you've got to have faith in us. And they did that. And one of the big issues was starting with a technical violator program. And, of course, those are the community correction centers. Those were initially set up, as I said, punishment centers. And that means the individuals, as I had said earlier, about how they were sentenced and what we saw, the high rate of return. But as we changed them to therapeutic communities, then we saw the numbers go down. We were able to go to the legislators and convince them that, look, give us money to open more of these centers. And they have been very, very effective. And it was, of course, like I say, there's evidence-based practices that we use in setting those up, the kinds of programs that we put in place to operate them. Then we went with a technical violator program and said, look, this is what's driving our prison population. If you will work with us, we see that if you give us a 300-bed unit, we will spend about $6 million building it. It will run about $2 million a year to operate that facility. And what we have seen is that in addition to the technical violator program, also in addition to what we have done with our staff in the field, and this is one of the first things that we did, is that we were looked at the numbers. We were sending 35% of our caseload back to ADC. And that caseload, at that point in time, when we were looking at the numbers, the caseload was running around 3,200. About 25,000 of those, or 6,000 of those, were parolees. 2,600 were probationers. Well, the parolees is what was driving it. We were sending 35% of our caseload back to prison. So we started to look at doing graduated sanctions. We placed some counselors in the field. We trained them as counselors, made sure that they were providing good programming. And today we have over 31,000 probation or parolees currently that we supervise. Arkansas is one of the fastest growing in terms of parole in the nation. And today we're sending only 8.66 of those offenders. This is the kinds of things that you're able to go to your legislator and show them the impact that it truly will have, that they're willing to make an investment. And that's what we've told them. You're making an investment in community correction. Our technical violator program, and following the numbers, we run through over 5,000 offenders, about 5,500 offenders through there. Today, what we're seeing is that now, and you got to remember, these are all failures, is that 27.7% of those end up either in ADC or DCC. And so you're taking 100% failure. You're able to take a quarter of those or three-quarters of those and keep them out of prison. Otherwise, those would have ended back up into the Department of Correction, and we knew from prior studies that they would stay about 9 months. We're sending those individuals through. It's a 60-day program. We pull from our therapeutic community to set up the programming. It's very intense, and we've had significant impact. And these are the things that you can sell your legislator, and this is what truly has worked. Drug courts, that's been one of the biggest issues and that legislators have really bought into, and you're getting it. And when you set up, well, I know when we set up our first one, we had it here in Pulaski County, but I knew that if I didn't get a lot of legislators involved, more than just one, you would not have the impact if you spread it out. And we looked at setting up, after we set this one up, we set up 8 additional drug courts. That gave us 8 different jurisdictions across the state. And it was a partnership that we created with the judges. Once those first 8 went in, I'm telling you, we had legislators coming to us asking us to set up drug courts in their judicial district. Judges were going to them. So it's very critical to have good numbers, have good data, that you're able to sit down with your legislator and show them the impact that you're truly going to have.
Hey, Jerry, let me ask you from the other side of the equation, how would you like to be approached? How do you want to be approached? How have you coached people in Texas to approach you with this kind of information?
Well, what I do, George, first of all, I'm a big question asker. So if you get a question from me, obviously give me the best answer you've got, because, as I said, I look for answers. I look for facts and supporting those facts. So if somebody's coming to us, first of all, let me say to anybody out there, don't be afraid to approach your legislator. If you've got good ideas or good suggestions, you go talk to that legislator or legislators. As David pointed out, there are multiple people that you can talk to. In the legislative channels, I will say that we talk to each other a lot. The various legislators talk to each other a lot. So once you get legislators talking in general about your subject, they become much more knowledgeable on the areas. And you know, I've had many Texas legislators now come back to me and say they're getting comments from other national organizations about what we've done and what we did, and it's coming to them and coming back through the cycle, which is always wonderful feedback for legislators to get on things that are working. But how do you approach them? Each legislator is different. There are some that are, I'll put them into the tones of, there are some that are much more interested in the financial side. There are some that are much more interested in the people side. What I found when I started doing all these things in corrections was that you could, in fact, bring the two sides together, because at that stage you started talking about being both tough and smart on the criminal justice side. And the tough thing was make sure you're public safe, and the smart thing is you use your money wisely and intelligently to make sure you're doing programs that work. So I like to see numbers. You bring me facts about your program, and bring me facts about what that program has done, and bring me at least your best suggestions on what needs to be done. And hopefully we'll be able to take those ideas and move them forward into suggestions or changes in the law, or to be able to provide the funding. We're in a position in Texas right now where a good number of our legislators truly believe in what we're doing and believe that we have made the difference in making it so we're not having to go spend additional money to build brick-and-mortar prisons, but in fact can use it wisely and use less money than we would be doing if we were just building brick-and-mortar. So approach them. Don't be afraid of them. They're in most cases, they're just people like the rest of us are. And don't be afraid to bring them up. If you got good ideas, many of them will be very receptive to it.
I appreciate you're also explaining to us that we really need to do our homework and our research in terms of what is the motivation for different legislators, and to be able to speak to them in a way that's relevant to where they find themselves being focused, as opposed to lecturing them about what our perspective would be.
They're focused. They're all different, by the way, George. Every one of them. If you have, 150 members in your legislature, I will guarantee the focus of there's 150 different focuses out there. It's a kaleidoscope, just like the entire system is that we operate and work with.
And they all end up being important when it comes time to pull that lever on that vote.
They all have a vote, and when it comes to getting implementation of a program or support financially, they all have the vote.
Sally, in Iowa, you've been at this business, as you indicated, for a long time now. By comparison, yours was one of the first jurisdictions that really bought into, and across the state in the 8 different agencies like your own, really took seriously the effort at implementation. So you've lived through a lot of different legislative cycles, and you've lived through changes in those different people who are now in office as opposed to who was there when the process started. So based on what Jerry said, how do you continue to keep it fresh? How do you continue to deal with a new crop of legislators who are constantly cycling through this process?
Well, I think one strategy, and I'm not sure that it was conscious by any means, but we have a lot of other obvious community players. We have victim rights groups, we have substance abuse providers, mental health providers. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is to educate them on evidence-based practices. And when we were looking, I'll just give you a specific example, 2,000-foot law for sex offenders, which in theory seems like it would be a really smart thing to do. But as you know, with a lot of folks, you know, it was using all of our resources and treating sex offenders as a one-size-fits-all. And I think what was most effective in our communicating with local policymakers was not so much us saying that it was hard, but it was also having the county attorney's office, the local sheriff's office, and then finally the victim advocates saying a one-size-fits-all for sex offenders is a bad use of resources. We have evidence to show that we need to concentrate on the highest risk offenders, because by concentrating on everybody, you're diluting our resources. So when you educate everyone in the community, when they're talking to local legislators, you can kind of, for lack of a better word, stick up for one another about what it is, the message that you want to give them. I think the other thing too is that a mistake that I made early on as a director is waiting for the session to then try to get my message across. And now we invite legislators to tour our facilities and educate them. Right after we get the new list of who's there, we try to reach out to them and talk about local issues right in our community and ask them if they have any questions, and if they allow us a couple minutes to educate them on what it is we're doing and provide them whatever information, and do it in bullet point. What I mean by don't ramble, don't take too much of their time, and make it really clear as far as what your message is.
That's excellent, Sally. Thank you. Kate, have we got some questions from the audience that we could pick up on? Kate, can you read me one of those questions? Have you ever felt that you were alone at a party?
George, I'm here with you.
Hey, George. Yeah, we're here.
Sally, I thought you had a couple of excellent ideas. Maybe we'll carry on a little discussion here on what you said about contacting legislators. And it's great. It's a great idea to contact someone who's newly elected or someone who's running for office, to get them involved in understanding your programs. That's very important, because we do have a large turnover in legislators over a period of time, some states more than others. And so know your state, but it's a great idea to get those people in and let them understand what you're doing as early as you possibly can, because there's a vast learning curve. The reality is, if you have 75 legislators in your staff, I will guarantee you that 90% of them probably had little or no experience in your system or your criminal justice system before the time they became legislators, unless they were practicing law and practicing defense or prosecution.
George, and let me follow up with what Representative Madden said. The thing about it is, when I first started in this business, it was much easier in one sense about dealing with legislators, because we had no term limits. Now we have term limits, and it sure does tax you to be able to stay on top or keeping them informed about what's going on. Before, we could go to the leaders, more or less the people who had the interest in the correctional field, the individuals who were chairs of committees, and you could pretty well and they were there year after year. And so once you were able to educate them, it was much easier to go back and talk to them about issues that you had concern with. But then as term limits come into place, it has made it much more difficult from the standpoint you really have to stay at the Capitol. When the legislators are in session, you have to visit with them once you find out where your strength is, or the people who have an interest in what you're doing. And then it's important to make sure that you educate them and keep them informed about what you're doing and the kind of programs you're running, and get them to come, as Sally said, and look at your programs. and to see, because it makes it a lot easier if they see what you're doing when you're talking to them. And the other point, I think she made a key issue about when you're doing presentations. I noticed in budget hearings or any other committee meetings is that when we do presentations, we simplify it down. We do it with bullet points. We try to get the impact. We show the impact that it will have on the economy and or the budget and the impact of what the program is doing. And when you do that, it makes it a lot easier to sell legislators because they can understand that, because they don't have a lot of time when you're in a committee meeting of trying to educate them on something of what you're doing that you spent a lifetime doing.
The time to educate them, David, is probably not in committee hearings. The time to educate them is probably either in individual meetings before committee hearings or other individual meetings even before sessions go. That's the time to really educate the elected official, because the representative is going to have obviously several different things going on at once. You're going to be hard to even keep them in their attention there right in front of you because they may have 40 different things going on at one time, particularly during a heated part of a legislative session. So get to them early, and make sure in depth, and don't rule out, because you don't know who your hero is going to be. You never know for sure. I will guarantee that when I became chairman of corrections, I don't think anybody thought I'd be the hero to be up here doing national things, saying what Texas did. But we've done it, and you don't know who that person's going to be. There are people around who could be the hero for your program. So.
Yeah, and another thing that I've had an opportunity or experience learning from an old county judge. He was telling me one time that when I first started in this in juvenile work, and it's always been an experience or something that has stayed with me. He was talking about his quorum court members, and he had one who was very much of a naysayer, always opposing him, and he put him on the budget committee, and no one really understood that. And he said, he told me, he said, David, well, the issue is that you put him on that committee, it's a whole lot easier to control him in a small committee than it is to get him into a large group. And that's kind of, I've used that in terms about dealing with legislators. When you find someone that you realize has got a problem maybe with your program or what's going on, I always make a point to go see them, talk to them, and try to find out what that issue is and make sure they understand the overall impact of what you're trying to do, and try to educate them as well. And that's been a good lesson for me.
And remember, the other side of this, too, guys, is that they have a big picture they're looking at, too, not just individual programs within individual departments. But when you start looking at the big picture for the state of Texas or the state, whatever state you're going to have, it's a big high. It's a 70,000-foot look instead of down here at a 3,000 or 5,000-foot level.
Panel, thank you for that wonderful discussion. We apologize for the bit of technological difficulty that we had here. We have lots of questions from our audience, and so we'd like to get to those at this time, if that's good with you. One of the questions that has come up that feeds off of the discussion you were just having was around engaging legislators and helping them understand the importance and economic value of evidence-based practice. In short, how do we explain it to them in a way that makes them care about it, and how do we create the message for the public that allows them to support evidence-based practice? Along those same lines, folks want to know, how do you do that same engagement process with the judiciary around sentencing?
Okay, I think what we're going to do in terms of the questions from the audience, in order to try to get through as many as possible, we'll hear the question from Kate, and then I'm going to throw the question to one person. Obviously, this won't exhaust all of the potential answers, but let's just have one response to each question, and that way we'll get through more questions. Based on this question and the discussion that's already taken place in terms of reaching legislators, Sally, would you be prepared to speak to, one, the engagement with judges, and two, how you get specific groups within the community to be willing to speak out in terms of, from a stakeholder point of view, what's important about the work that you're doing?
Sure, I'll give it a try. We try to educate the judges as much as we can about how evidence-based practices will actually help them do their jobs. For example, when we went to standard pre-sentence investigations using risk assessment tools, some of the selling points was that the risk assessment tool would make it so whether PSI was written in Des Moines, Iowa versus Mason City, Iowa, you're going to get the same information. It's not going to vary across the state, and therefore, you get the same information that would be gathered in a less biased way. So people's prejudices aren't going to play into it. So my gut's not the thing telling you this information. I'm not making recommendations based on my gut and my own prejudices. I'm making those recommendations based on some validated risk assessment tools. And really, when we work with other jurisdictions, it's the same with working primarily, I'll just give you the example again, with victims' rights groups. Meeting with them and talking about what their goals are. And their goals are slightly different than what our goals are in corrections, but we all want to protect the public. We want a safer community. We want to reduce crime. And then just agreeing that outside of evidence-based practices, there is a thing called just desserts. And it has very little to do with reducing recidivism, and just acknowledging that from the get-go, that that's just another piece. But again, going back to talking about if your goal and my goal is both to protect victims, punitive measures may not be the best way to protect victims, and then being able to walk them through that process of, when, again, talking about domestic violence, for example, most victim advocates know that many women don't necessarily want to leave the relationship. They want their partner to stop battering. So that's just an example of talking to them about just desserts is not a bad thing. It's a goal in and of itself in sentencing, but if your goals are the same as far as reducing recidivism or victimization, you join with them there and start talking to them and inviting them to your trainings and getting their perspective and being able to listen to it. Same with law enforcement and county attorneys and substance abuse agencies. Just sharing that information, getting information from them, and then showing them how what we're doing actually supports what their vision and goal is too.
I think part of what you're also explaining to us, Sally, is that if evidence-based environments, business environments, are really about producing outcomes, and if the other people in the criminal justice system can agree with us in terms of what those outcomes are, for instance, fewer new crimes and fewer new victims, then we don't have to spend all of our time arguing about the activities, but we can begin to look and to see whether the activities that we're carrying out really do advance those outcomes, or whether they were emotionally desirable activities but really not very productive. And that's an important message for us to hear. Kate, what's the next question that you've got there from our audience?
Well, along those same lines of an evidence-based work environment, folks are wondering what are the best strategies for getting staff to change the way they do business and approach offender engagement because they don't feel that training alone can do that.
I think that's a great question. And David, you spoke earlier about trying to change the culture within your organization. Would you expand on that discussion, particularly as it relates to first-line supervisors and line officers?
Sure, George. The issue, of course, of training is the first. I guess is the first part of that is getting people to understand what you're trying to do. Make sure that they, communication, training. But then what you've got to do is to set up mechanisms, and I think this had been mentioned earlier in terms of follow-through, to make sure that staff is doing that. Sometimes it may get more difficult in terms of you may have to put some kind of reward in a sense, and maybe just let me share an example with you, motivational interviewing. We brought an individual in. We trained all our staff on motivational interviewing techniques, a professor from Oklahoma. We trained our trainers. The issue was because we wanted to be able to sustain the program, so we trained trainers, and then we trained our staff. Well, I knew the staff. We trained them. We told them how important it was. We knew we advised them that we would be following up with studies, see the impact that it had after we trained them. But probably 70% of them just blew it off. So then in order to this past legislative session, we were able to get an additional parole officer. And when I say additional parole officer, we got a parole officer 1, 2, and then we had a parole agent. Well, we tied that into the we tied that into the motivational interviewing and the techniques about how to on the graduated sanctions of dealing with offenders in the community. Well, what we found is that although we thought we had pretty well everyone trained, we found out we did not, because we made motivational interviewing part of this process of being able to be promoted. And what we required them to do is that they had to demonstrate, the three of our trainers, two had to demonstrate that they knew the skills and were able to implement or to use the skills of motivational interviewing. And we found it took a while for us to get staff on board in terms to be able to use it. But in that case, we used monetary incentives to be able to get individuals on board with it. And as one of the in order for the promotion, you had to demonstrate your skills, motivational interviewing. You had to understand policies and procedures of the operation in terms of community correction. And it really, then the final part of that was you had to come in and do an interview with management team before the promotion was made. And what we found, really the cream rose to the top. And I don't think it makes any difference of what you implement. You're always going to have some naysayers, but you've got to look at being able to follow, to make sure they're doing it, if the outcomes, and making sure that they understand communication and outcomes is very critical to.
Great job, David. It shouldn't be too terribly surprising, as Sally shared with us earlier, that many of the same principles that we're employing with offenders, because they're predicated on evidence of behavior change with human beings, work effectively then with staff. And that if it's necessary for offenders to go through some skill training and to be coached about how to adopt a new way of doing business, it probably isn't too surprising that we need to be coaching our own staff and acknowledging how they can be successful. Kate, what's your next question for us?
In follow-up to what you were just discussing, folks are wondering if NIC can provide resources, or if there are in fact resources on the website around hiring and behavioral interviewing competency profiles for both for officers.
We're all passing that question to you, George.
You know, Jerry, you are very, very quick. You know, the timing couldn't be better. Are you sure that it wasn't one of us that planted that question, Kate? The reason I joke about that is that there are some new materials that are going to be coming out, and they're based on the business that NIC and CJI have done together in a variety of different jurisdictions and structures, from state departments of corrections to court-based probation systems, statewide implementation efforts, and local large urban county implementation efforts. And there's two products that come to my mind, and Kate, you leap in as well. One of those is the implementation manual, which I think is close to coming back from the printers, which takes us through all of the steps of effective implementation. The second document that I think is going to be tremendously valuable is a document on human resource management. And so we keep talking about this alignment. We keep hearing, for instance, in Sally's description, about how you need to restructure the job description to talk about the competencies that you have to demonstrate, that it's necessary to take different approaches in terms of where do I advertise in order to get the right kind of competencies. How do I work with the universities or community colleges that are developing the human resource for me to select from? how do we go through the interviewing process in a way that increases the likelihood of selecting people who really have a capacity to do the work that we want done in a way that we want it to be done. I think these two documents, which as they're produced will be up and be available both on the NIC website and the CJI website, are a couple of very tangible, practical guides that will be available for the field. Okay, Kate, you got another one.
Yes, we do, George. We have lots of folks asking for follow-up information about the technical violation centers from both David and Jerry. And because those are a bit more specific, we're going to let folks know that we're in fact going to respond to that in the frequently asked questions follow-up document that we will send out to all participants. So those questions will be saved for later. The question I'd like to pose to you right now has to do with training of supervisors and clinical staff to ensure fidelity. Folks are asking if supervisors needed additional clinical training to operate in an evidence-based environment.
Well, Sally, this is one that again, I think the different districts in Iowa have had some experience with. How would you respond to that question about the training and the development of supervisors in order to support an evidence-based environment?
Oh, absolutely. Supervisors are key. If you don't have experts as supervisors, this will crash and burn quickly. You can have a director who supports it and thinks it's the right thing, and then you can have a few supervisors who support and think it's the right thing and so forth. But you have got to have those frontline supervisors trained and experts. And so I always use the same model that David talked about, that many of our supervisors were trained as trainers. And you know what you find from learning is that if you have to train and teach other people how to do it, you're going to be more proficient. And I think the other piece of it is unfortunately, supervisors have found that that's part of the job description. That's what's required. Their jobs have changed for many of them, and they've had to make some decisions about does this fall in line with what they want to do still, or do they want to do something else? And I think that's been kind of a difficult thing for people who started this business before we went into this. So I talked a lot about hiring the right people from the get-go, because as you know, somebody who naturally has motivational interviewing skills is a lot easier to help them improve those skills than someone that's starting out with very few of those skills and trying to teach them. And again, looking at the right attitudes and trying to measure those. But again, I think one of the mistakes we made, I know one of the mistakes we made in the early 90s were setting supervisors in with line staff, training everybody at once, and then saying, there you go, good luck with that. And now instead, supervisors constantly have, well, at least in my jurisdiction, booster sessions. They don't have to be long. They don't have to be intense. I'll give you a quick example. During our all supervisors management team meetings, we have tried to carve out an hour to practice MI skills. And what we do is we don't even have it be about offenders. We may have them role play difficult situations with employees and have them practice how would you use your MI skills in addressing an employee who's chronically late and has a lot of issues going on, for example. So again, I can't emphasize enough how important those frontline supervisors are, not only to have the skills but the right attitude and to really buy into the process, because if they don't buy in, that's where your weak links are.
Just as a follow-up, Sally, how dependent are you in developing clinical skills within your first-line supervisors, or do you have resource people who have those clinical skills, or do you contract for some of that?
We actually are beginning to hire more individuals that have those clinical skills. We have, someone with their PhD, a licensed psychologist that's on staff, and he helps provide that. And then we also have positions that are called community treatment coordinators. And these are all folks, most of them have, a lot of them have their master's degrees in social work. And they will also help coach and provide some of the quality assurance and training to fill in, where the supervisors don't. The other thing that we're looking at too is obviously you've got some supervisors that are going to have going to have more skills in that area than others. use responsivity with your supervisors too. What I mean by that is if you've got a supervisor that's got some clinical background, it would make sense. You know, our supervisor of our sex offender program has his PhD, and he got his PhD in the area looking primarily at sex offenders. The supervisor of our batters education program, you know, she has a law degree, but she also has very good clinical skills and worked in a violence shelter. So again, one of our supervisors that maybe is not as clinical but is very, very organized, he oversees our banked caseload section, and he's very good at making sure that contacts are being made and making sure that, you know, staff collect restitution and do those kinds of things. So again, you're going to want to assess staff and figure out where they most are needed. And again, in assessing staff, it's just like working with offenders. You're going to have some management that are very low risk, meaning they know how to do this stuff, they get it, and you don't have to spend a lot of time with them other than to encourage them to keep doing what they're doing and praising them. And then you're going to have to spend the bulk of your time working with those folks that just don't have the skills and need more of your time.
Great response. Thank you, Sally. Those are some really helpful tips. Kate, what's our next question?
I think we have time for 2 more questions, George, and so the first one I'll throw out for you is, how are outcome measures developed, and what's the best way to determine measures and outcomes?
How about it, David? How did you decide on what it is that you were going to measure? And then how did you get that in place? And again, getting back to this whole integrity and fidelity, how do you really trust your numbers?
Well, of course, one thing, you got to have a good research department and a good that you can rely on. But I'll take a couple examples. One is a technical violator program. Is first of all, we looked at how many people were going back to prison and for what reason. Then after we determined that, then we had to sit down and say, okay, how many do we think that we can divert out of that? We looked at the technical violations. We looked at the new crimes that was committed, and yet they were going back to prison. They committed new crimes, but they were going back as technical violations, and we were sending about 260. And looking at the numbers, we figured we'd divert probably 100, 125 a month out of that based upon the numbers. And those numbers held true as we developed the program when we started tracking, and we've got about 7, 8 years now of tracking numbers, is that those numbers have held pretty well true what we had. But you've got to determine what is it that you do want to measure. I mean, what is it you're trying to do? I think the other issue is as we placed counselors in the field, as we started to reduce our numbers when we were sending 35% of our parole caseload back to the prison system, is that we had to look at those numbers and say, okay, you know, what are we doing now, and why are they going back? And then as we started to implement the graduated sanctions, then track those as to why they were being diverted, how they were being diverted, and where they were going. Motivational interviewing is another issue. We don't have 3 years of data yet, but as we have implemented that program, is that we knew what the numbers were, and we can break it down by officer. And then, of course, and like I say, what you're wanting to do, what is you're trying to do, what is it that you want to achieve, and once you determine that, then make sure that you've got your data before you start, and then to be sure that you're able to follow up and that it does prove. And if it doesn't prove out, and I think it was mentioned earlier by somebody, is that even though you may have a good program, and I knew when we talked about our technical violator program, that we may have a good program, but if in the outcomes and numbers who go through those, and I'll back that is that if you're not having results and you know that you've got a good program, then you may need to look at how your program is being implemented. Is the staff doing what you wanted them to do before you scrap that program that you may have just started, where it be a therapeutic community, a pro violator? So this, you need to understand what you want to achieve, and then make sure that you follow up and that it's achieving it, and then you've got to analyze and say, okay, if it's not, then why is it not doing it? And it may be something internally. It could be staffing. It could be the type of programming that you have put in place. And it may be training, that you haven't done a good job of training, communicating, and so forth.
Great job, David. Kate, what's that last question that you want us to tackle?
And finally, folks really want to get some examples of efforts that have been tried but have been unsuccessful, and the learnings that folks have taken away from those instances.
Sally, I know that you haven't had any failures in the things that you've attempted, but as you've watched your colleagues in other parts of the state, without naming names, what would some of those things be?
Well, I think I've already probably drilled this into the ground, but if you're not strategic in your implementation, if you don't have good follow-through, if you don't make sure that if you don't have fidelity and follow-through, if you don't support staff who are trying to do this work when they're fighting against the odds, if you don't educate, take the time to educate public defenders and judges and other stakeholders, it can crumble pretty quickly. And I think the other piece too is understanding the big picture. And one quick example is, drugs work really, really well, but they're pretty expensive, and they don't treat a lot of big numbers typically compared to some of our other cognitive behavioral programming. So again, trying to make sure that people don't just run with drug courts are the best thing since sliced bread, because they are for certain offenders in certain circumstances. But again, people want to have a magic bullet, and trying to make sure that staff don't start to feel like, this is assessment of the year or program of the year or whatever, and helping people see that these are all just tools and that things are going to change. Don't promise your staff that this is the way, we're going to do business, because what I tell them, it's just like your computer. The basics of your computer will probably be pretty similar, but once the pain and cost of learning how to use the new program, are outweighed by the benefits of the new computer system, then we'll kind of stick with what we have. And I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I think people kind of got into, okay, this is what we're doing now. And trying to really let people know that, no, we're going to have to adapt and change. As we get information about what's working and what's not, we need to pay attention to that and adapt and change.
George, if I could add one little thing to that.
Please do, Jerry.
What we did on the state level is, first of all, Sally's talked about the pieces and how do they work and how well do they work. That's one of the implementation things you can do, is you can look at just pieces of the puzzle and do things, or you can look at the whole big system that we have and try to do things that change the whole process and the whole system. That's what we actually did in Texas, and I found that to be, without that, somewhere along the line we reached the tipping point. And when you reach that tipping point, you begin to get the things that you're really looking for, which is greater public safety at a reasonable cost, with programs that do work and change people's lives. And I think that in the end, that's what you're driving for.
Thank you for that contribution, Jerry.